The identity of one of the world's most notorious serial killers may have been discovered. Forensic scientists say Jack the Ripper's real name may have been Aaron Kosminski. That's according to genetic test results published last week.
The world's most infamous killer left behind a single piece of evidence that could solve everything? What if that evidence sat hidden for over a century, waiting for the right moment to speak? In the heart of Victorian London, when gas lamps flickered against cobblestone streets and fog wrapped around every corner like a living thing, someone moved through the darkness with terrifying purpose. The name Jack the Ripper became more than just a murderer's alias. It became a ghost story, a legend.
Serial killers' nicknames come up a lot on this show, but for my money, the best one probably is the first one, Jack the Ripper. Gotta be honest, the name Aaron Kosminski just doesn't have the same impact. Doesn't pack the same punch.
An unsolved riddle that haunted every generation that followed. But sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried. Stay with us as we uncover how a blood-stained piece of fabric may have finally revealed the truth about history's most notorious monster. The streets where death walked freely. To grasp who this killer was, you first need to understand where he hunted. Whitechapel in 1888 wasn't the London of fancy theaters and afternoon garden parties.
London, England, July 1888. 2 months before the horrific Whitechapel killing spree began, an American named Francis Tumblety arrived in the city, although this was not his first trip to London.
This was the London that wealthy folks pretended didn't exist at all. Picture 76,000 people squeezed into barely 1 square mile of cramped, rotting buildings. Eastern European refugees running from violence back home lived shoulder to shoulder with Irish workers, English families who'd lost everything, and anyone else who'd fallen through the cracks of an empire that claimed to rule the world. The air itself told stories of suffering. Horse waste mixed with rotting food scraps, coal smoke, and human filth created a smell that never left your clothes. Slaughterhouses lined the main roads, their gutters literally flowing red with animal blood every single day. Kids with eyes too old for their faces hawked matches on street corners. Women sold the only thing they had left to sell. If you couldn't scrape together 4 pennies for a bed in the disgusting rental rooms, you paid to sleep standing up, leaning against a rope stretched across a communal room. And if you had absolutely nothing, you walked the streets until sunrise, praying you'd survive to see morning. This wasn't just poverty. This was a world where someone's scream might go completely unnoticed or deliberately ignored. Police barely patrolled these areas, and the people living there had learned long ago not to trust authority anyway. The darkness felt alive with possibility for anyone willing to exploit the vulnerable, and into this nightmare walked a killer who understood something crucial. In Whitechapel, becoming invisible was the easiest thing in the world. The women history almost forgot. Everyone remembers the killer's name, but barely anyone recalls the actual people who died. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old and had given birth to 5 children she could no longer take care of. On the final night of August in 1888, the lodging house turned her away because she didn't have 4 pennies for a bed.
Mary Jane was the only victim to be murdered indoors. In her room in Miller's Court, the Ripper had the time and space to realize his very darkest fantasies.
But she wasn't discouraged. She'd just gotten herself a new bonnet, black velvet, and she felt rather proud wearing it. Those cheerful words were among the last anyone heard from her. Hours later, someone discovered her body on Buck's Row. Her throat had been sliced so deeply, it nearly took her head clean off. Her stomach had been cut open with shocking precision. Annie Chapman had once known better days. At 47, she'd been married, raised 3 children, lived what people called a respectable life. But alcohol, sickness, and tragedy had stripped everything away, piece by piece. By September 1888, she was selling flowers and handmade crochet work, sometimes doing things she probably never imagined she'd have to do just to survive another day. On September 8th, she left the lodging house around 2 in the morning, looking weak and unsteady. She promised she'd be back soon. At roughly 5:30 that morning, someone found her body in a backyard. This time, the killer had taken his time. Her intestines had been deliberately placed over her shoulder. Her uterus was completely gone. Elizabeth Stride was 44, born in Sweden, and had survived more than most people could imagine. She worked cleaning buildings, sewed when work was available. On September 30th, people saw her laughing with some man on the street. At 1 in the morning, a cart driver turned his horse into a yard, and the animal suddenly refused to move forward, spooked by something in the shadows. It was Elizabeth. Her throat had been cut, blood still pumping from the wound. But something was different this time. There were no cuts to her stomach, no organs removed. The killer had been interrupted. His ritual had been broken. He wasn't done for the night. 45 minutes later, less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes died in Meter Square. She'd been released from the police station at 1 in the morning after being locked up for public drunkenness. She joked that she'd probably get in trouble when she got home. But she never made it home. A police constable found her at 1:44 in the morning. He'd walked through that exact same square just 15 minutes earlier and seen absolutely nothing. Now there was a body that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. Catherine's face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her stomach had been opened. Her intestines had been pulled out and arranged over her shoulder. Her left kidney and uterus had been removed with what the doctor described as considerable knowledge of human anatomy. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the others. She was only 25, younger than the rest, and by Whitechapel standards, doing relatively well. She had her own room. She'd traveled to France once, spoke with hints of education in her voice. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, the rent collector knocked on her door. No answer came, but he could see through a broken window. What he witnessed would traumatize him for the rest of his days. Mary Jane Kelly hadn't just been murdered. She'd been systematically destroyed. Her entire body had been opened and emptied. Her organs had been removed and placed around the room with deliberate arrangement. Her face had been mutilated so badly, no one could recognize her. The killer had spent hours with her. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared in the fog, Jack the Ripper vanished into history. A predator who knew every shadow. What made this killer so effective wasn't supernatural intelligence. It was understanding. He knew Whitechapel the way a wolf knows its hunting grounds. He understood the pattern of police patrols, the rhythm of the night streets, the narrow passages where a man could slip from one street to another in seconds, completely invisible in the fog and darkness. His timing was absolutely perfect. Most murders happened in the brief gaps between police patrols, those 15-minute windows he exploited with surgical precision. He worked fast, quietly, with complete control. Medical evidence suggests the murders took no more than 5 to 10 minutes from first cut to final mutilation. There was never a prolonged struggle, never a scream loud enough to bring witnesses running. The locations themselves tell a story. These weren't random picks. Each spot offered darkness, relative privacy, and multiple escape routes. He knew exactly where the gas lamps ended and shadows began. He understood that in Whitechapel, minding your own business wasn't just polite. It was a survival strategy. Even if someone heard something suspicious, they were unlikely to investigate. The method speaks to psychology as much as pathology. This wasn't wild, frenzied violence. The cuts were deliberate and purposeful. The removal of organs suggested either real anatomical knowledge or carefully practiced technique, probably both. This was ritual. This was performance. This was someone who'd found a way to express something dark living inside him and discovered he could do it with near-complete impunity. And then there's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. he stopped. After Mary Jane Kelly, the murders everyone agrees were his work simply ended. Either he died, got locked up in an asylum, left the country, or just stopped killing. This last possibility is the most chilling. The idea that someone capable of such acts could simply walk away, returning to normal life, while the entire world searched frantically for a monster. When investigation met chaos. The police investigation was a disaster from the beginning. Two completely different police forces had authority over the murder locations, and they barely cooperated with each other. Neither force had any experience dealing with serial murder. The very concept barely existed in Victorian thinking. Inspector Frederick Aberline led the Metropolitan Police efforts. He was competent, thorough, and completely overwhelmed. Thousands of statements were collected. Hundreds of suspects were questioned. The police received countless letters, many from people claiming to be the actual killer. The most famous letter, signed Jack the Ripper, gave the murderer his lasting name, though most modern experts believe it was a hoax created by a journalist. The letter, with its mocking tone and promise of more murders, captured public imagination like nothing else. The name Jack the Ripper stuck because it had that dramatic quality the press and public found irresistible. As the murders continued, panic spread like wildfire. Vigilante groups formed. Newspapers published increasingly wild theories. Every foreign-looking man became a suspect. Jewish immigrants especially faced violent prejudice and attacks. The investigation eventually focused on three primary suspects named in a confidential police document. Montague John Druitt was a lawyer and teacher whose body turned up in the Thames River in December 1888. Michael Ostrog was a Russian criminal with a history of violence and diagnosed insanity. And Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who worked cutting hair and was eventually committed to an asylum with a diagnosis that included hearing voices and other disturbing symptoms. But none of these men were ever charged with anything. The evidence was circumstantial at absolute best. The police had no forensic tools whatsoever. DNA analysis wouldn't exist for another century. Fingerprinting was barely understood. Blood typing hadn't even been discovered yet. So the case went cold, the murder stopped, and Jack the Ripper passed from immediate threat into eternal legend. When science reached into history. For over 100 years, that's exactly where the story sat, frozen in time and mystery, until a piece of fabric emerged that would change everything. In 2006, a businessman named Russell Edwards bought something at auction that would become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in criminal history, a silk shawl supposedly taken from Catherine Endow's crime scene. According to a story that can't be fully proven, the shawl had been grabbed by a sergeant named Amos Simpson who was at the scene, and his family kept it as a strange heirloom for over a century. The shawl had dark stains that looked like blood. Edwards, obsessed with solving history's greatest mystery, brought in Dr. Jari Luhalainen, a molecular biologist, to conduct DNA analysis on the fabric. The process was incredibly difficult. DNA breaks down over time, especially on fabric exposed to varying conditions for 125 years. But modern techniques can sometimes recover genetic material even from ancient samples. Dr. Luhalainen identified sequences of mitochondrial DNA from bloodstains on the shawl. He compared these sequences to a living descendant of Catherine Endow's. The match was positive. The blood almost certainly came from Catherine. But there was something more. Another section of the shawl contained traces of semen. DNA pulled from these stains was compared to a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. Again, the analysis showed a match. After 137 years, science appeared to accomplish what Victorian detectives couldn't. The identity of Jack the Ripper, according to this analysis, was Aaron Kosminski, a poor Polish Jewish immigrant who got institutionalized in 1891 and died in obscurity in an asylum in 1919. The announcement made headlines worldwide. Books got published. Documentaries were produced. The mystery, it seemed, had finally been solved. But really? The scientific community responded with deep skepticism. Mitochondrial DNA, while useful, is far less specific than nuclear DNA. It can identify family lines, but cannot pinpoint specific individuals. The match to Kosminski's descendants proves only that someone from his mother's family line came into contact with the shawl, not necessarily Aaron himself, and not necessarily in 1888. The shawl's history remains questionable. There's no contemporary documentation, no police evidence log, no proper chain of custody proving it actually came from the crime scene. Victorian police were generally careful about evidence, yet this shawl appears in exactly 0 official records. Contamination is another massive concern. The shawl passed through multiple hands over 125 years. It was stored in unknown conditions, displayed, handled, potentially washed or treated. Any of these exposures could have introduced genetic material that has absolutely nothing to do with 1888. Multiple DNA experts pointed out that the study was never peer-reviewed or published in any scientific journal, which is the gold standard for validating forensic claims. And there's a deeper philosophical problem too. Even assuming the DNA evidence is authentic and correctly interpreted, it proves only that Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski, or someone from his mother's family line, came into contact with the same piece of fabric at some point. It doesn't prove murder. It doesn't prove presence at the actual crime scene. In a modern courtroom, it would be circumstantial evidence at best. Yet Kosminski remains a compelling suspect for reasons that go beyond DNA. He lived in Whitechapel. He was the right age, 23 in 1888. He worked as a hairdresser, giving him access to sharp blades and possibly some basic knowledge of anatomy. Within just a few years of the murders, he was locked up in an asylum with symptoms suggesting severe mental illness, including paranoia and claims that voices commanded him to do things. Most intriguingly, a document surfaced in the 1980s, margin notes written by former Chief Inspector Donald Swanson in his personal copy of another officer's memoir. Swanson, who oversaw the Ripper investigation, wrote that police had identified the killer as a Polish Jew living in Whitechapel, who was identified by a witness, but whom that witness refused to testify against because of ethnic loyalty. The suspect was later institutionalized and died in an asylum. Though Swanson doesn't write the name in his notes, every single detail matches Aaron Kosminski perfectly. So perhaps the real question isn't whether Kosminski was Jack the Ripper with absolute certainty, but whether the evidence, both historical and scientific, points to him more strongly than any other suspect in 137 years of endless speculation. The fog is slowly lifting over Whitechapel after more than a century. But even as science reaches across time to offer answers, we're left facing deeper questions. Why does Jack the Ripper still fascinate us so intensely? Why do we remember his name, but struggle to recall the names of the women he killed? Perhaps it's because his story reflects something fundamental about humanity itself, our endless dance with darkness. The Victorian era gave birth to the modern world, but it also created vast inequalities that made monsters not just possible, but almost inevitable. Jack the Ripper was as much a product of his environment as he was of whatever pathology lived inside him. He thrived because society created the exact conditions that allowed him to hunt unnoticed, and because the women he killed were already invisible to those who held power. We need to remember Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They weren't nameless unfortunates. They were human beings with full histories, with children they loved, with dreams that got destroyed by circumstances often completely beyond their control. Their deaths revealed as much about Victorian society's failures as they did about their killer's twisted mind. The truth is, we may never know with absolute certainty who Jack the Ripper truly was. The mystery has endured for over a century, surviving investigations, theories, confessions, and scientific studies, yet it refuses to yield its final secret. But what we do know, without question, are the lives and names of his victims, women who walked the foggy streets of Whitechapel, forgotten by society, but immortalized by tragedy. Perhaps that is the real revelation, the part of the story that matters most. The infamous shawl, if it indeed dates back to those horrifying nights, still whispers through time, carrying faint traces of DNA and unanswered questions. Aaron Kosminski's name, often repeated, carries both the conviction of Victorian detectives and the fragile endorsement of modern forensics, two eras reaching for the same shadow, hoping to define it. Yet the legend remains alive, and perhaps it always will. Because this story isn't merely about uncovering a killer's identity, it's about confronting the darkness that lingers within humanity itself. The Ripper's ghost is not confined to history. It walks beside us, disguised in modern forms, driven by the same hunger for power, fear, and control. Now, 137 years later, the mist over Whitechapel has finally begun to lift, but its echoes still cling to the narrow streets, like ghosts that refuse to fade. The cobblestones may have long since dried, yet the memory of what happened there continues to bleed through time, a wound history never fully healed. Evil, after all, doesn't disappear. It simply hides, waiting for the world to grow complacent once again. It lingers in the dark corners of every city, wearing new faces, finding new ways to prey upon the forgotten and the voiceless. The story of Jack the Ripper is no longer just about one man's cruelty. It's a reflection of how easily society can overlook its most vulnerable. If this journey through the fog of history captured your imagination, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries that shaped our world. Countless secrets still wait in the shadows, and together we'll bring their stories to light.